Hello and welcome to lecture number 7. Today's topic, New Ideologies, which really came to the forefront between 1815 and 1900. Today's lecture will address 4 new ideologies which were developed during this era. In a way, it's a return to the intellectual history that was discussed a little earlier this term. The first of these ideologies would be socialism, and then you could also associate communism within it. Political liberalism, nationalism, and imperialism. We'll see how these new ideologies had an impact on the history of Europe. First, we're going to look at how society was impacted by the ideas of socialism and communism. Socialism evolved as an alternative to capitalism in the mid-1800s. If you want a textbook definition of socialism, it's actually pretty straightforward. This would be public or governmental ownership of all means of production and distribution of goods, or essentially, public ownership of all businesses. The goal would be to redistribute property equally among everyone in society. Communism is a type or a form of socialism. Once again, you would have an equal distribution of property. There would be no private property. All of the means of production would be controlled by the state. However, the thing that's different about communism is that it involves a bloody and violent revolution. That's how the changes in society would be brought about. I'd like to mention 2 individuals who shaped discussions of socialism and communism. The first is shown here. His name was Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818. He came from a middle-class family. Eventually, he became a journalist and a radical. While he was born in Germany, he was later exiled and spent much of his life in London. He became an advocate for industrial workers and tried to improve conditions under which they worked. One of the works that he co-wrote was the Communist Manifesto. Another German is shown here. His name is Friedrich Engels. He came from a wealthy family, and his family owned factories, particularly those in London. As he began to operate his family's factories, he realized the horrible conditions under which his workers were living. He became an advocate for workers as well. He's the other co-author of the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was co-written by Marx and Engels and published in 1848. It had a few main arguments. First of all, it argued that throughout all of human history, every society has been plagued by conflict, particularly class conflict. Those with power, and in the case of the 1840s, owners of factories, exploited those who did not have power, particularly workers in those factories. The time period in which they were writing dealt with the industrial era. However, if you were to go back in time, even back to the ancient Egyptians, pharaohs had power. The people who did not have power built the Great Pyramids. There was class conflict back then. The haves, or pharaohs, or the people who were members of the nobility in ancient Egypt, they were the ones who exploited the work of average individuals. This was carried throughout all of human history, with the Greeks, the Romans, during the Middle Ages, and up to the Industrial Revolution. What Marx and Engels predicted was that once a country went through the Industrial Revolution, the workers would develop a class consciousness. They would realize, hey, we're all being exploited. And what they would do is they would overthrow the owners of those factories in a bloody and violent revolution. And what they would do is they would establish a brand new society based on freedom and equality. That was the theory behind the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels were writing in the mid-1800s. Well, eventually their ideas were applied in, of all places, Russia in the early 1900s. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll look at politics next. Political liberalism is the next ideology to be addressed. One person who influenced the discussion was John Stuart Mill. You see him here on the left. One of his famous works was On Liberty. Political liberalism addresses the idea that everyone's civil liberties should be protected. These are things like free speech, freedom of press. If you're arrested, you get a jury trial. There's due process that has to be followed. Remember this slide from the French Revolution? It kind of had its origins in this document, The Rights of Man, and the Rights of Man had its origins in the Declaration of Independence. One of the concepts that was associated with political liberalism was that every man should be guaranteed natural rights and should be treated equally. Some additional ideas were included in political liberalism. One dealt with religion, and the idea of freedom of religion and a separation of church and state. There also was support for a representative or a republican form of government. They supported the right to vote, but this was only for men. Written constitutions, and while there were some attacks on the monarchy, as long as there was a constitution that was written that limited the actions of a monarch, most political liberals were okay with a constitutional monarchy. The alternative perspective would be political conservatism. Their goal was to maintain the status quo. For centuries, monarchs such as Louis XIV or Peter the Great, as shown here, had ruled in different parts of Europe. So conservatives were more likely to support monarchy. There is one note that I would like to point out. Please recognize that there's a difference between liberals versus conservatives of today. We're not talking about Democrats versus Republicans. In the 1800s, liberals supported civil liberties and a limited government. Conservatives supported maintaining the status quo. The ideas concerning political liberalism came to a head early in 1848 when crowds in Paris rebelled against the French government. The government was unwilling to expand voting rights for men. The king at the time, Louis Philippe, abdicated, or he vacated and left France. A republic was declared. This fever of revolution spread throughout Europe. This map identifies where these revolutions of 1848 took place. The circled area on the map identifies Paris, where they began. And then several different spots are highlighted here. They took place over much of West Central Europe. We're talking Berlin and Frankfurt, Milan, Florence and Rome, Prague, Vienna, and many other cities. These are places where people rebelled against the government. As the revolution spread, there were a series of goals that people had in mind. They sought changes such as universal male suffrage. And by that, I mean they wanted all adult men to have the right to vote. They supported individual freedoms like freedom of the press. They also sought the elimination of traditional feudal obligations that the peasants had had to perform for centuries. Basically, they wanted peasants to be able to leave the manors where they had grown up and to have freedom to travel and things like that. They also supported written constitutions. A particular pattern began to emerge with these revolutions. Initially, there was a tremendous amount of excitement, and people were unified as they came together to fight against traditional excesses of the government and against monarchs. But then the rebels began to lose momentum, and different leaders emerged who had separate goals. Eventually, many conservatives or monarchists weakened reforms that had initially been put into place, or in some cases, like in Prussia and in Austria, the military was used to crush these rebellions. Events in France can be seen as an example because this is where the revolutions began. As a result of the revolutions, the French ended up having an election, and they chose Louis Napoleon to be their president. This was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. However, by 1851, he staged a military coup, established himself as the new monarch. Now, it was a constitutional monarchy. However, while he claimed to be more democratic, it really was authoritarian in practice. Here we see a portrait of Louis Napoleon. After he became the monarch, he was known as Napoleon III. In the end, we do see that some reforms did remain in place. There was expanded right to vote or suffrage for many men in different parts of Europe. The system of feudalism, which had been destroyed in France in the past, it was destroyed throughout all of Europe. However, for reformers, there weren't enough reforms put into place. These also came at a high cost. Many rebels were imprisoned. Many also became martyrs, as hundreds and even thousands in some communities were killed. Next, we'll explore the rise of nation-states with a focus on events in Italy and Germany. The next ideology to be explored is nationalism, and I tried to find a good definition. The best one I could find was on Wikipedia, and you see it here. It's a belief whereby a person begins to identify with their nation, or there's a special attachment to it. This was a new concept or idea in the 19th century. It involved a shared sense of identity. Often there's a common language, religion, or customs that are associated with the development of nationalism. Very quickly, I wanted to identify this map of Europe from 1815. Notice the circled area. This area includes what is now the modern-day country of Germany, but notice there is no country of Germany. There was a confederation of German states, not one nation. Here's another map that identifies the distribution of different languages in Europe. There were Slavic languages, Hellenic or Greek, Germanic, Latin, etc. Notice the yellow, the Germanic languages. There was no country of Germany, yet in Central Europe, in the yellow there were several people who spoke the same language and had a lot of the same heritage. This influenced the development of nationalism in that region. The best examples of the development of nationalism are shown here with the two flags, the flags of Germany and Italy. We'll see how nationalism developed in these two regions next. Once again, here's that map of Europe from 1815 with a focus on political boundaries. The red arrows point to the different sections of Italy. It was not one country in 1815. It was several different kingdoms. And the blue identifies the location of several German confederations or German states. This map identifies Europe in 1871. Notice the difference. The two arrows here point to the nation of Germany and the nation of Italy. We'll see how these two countries became unified next. This map focuses on the different regions of Italy prior to unification. The arrows here point to Lombardy and Venetia. See, Italy was divided and occupied for centuries by other countries. The nation of Austria controlled those regions of Lombardy and Venetia. One important individual who shaped Italian unification is shown here. His name is Camillo Cavour. He was the Prime Minister of Sardinia. Once again, here's that map of Italian unification. The arrows here point to the two regions included in the Kingdom of Sardinia. The first is to the Piedmont, and then the island of Sardinia. Cavour was a major player with Italian unification because he had a very specific goal. He wanted to unify all of northern Italy under one monarch. That monarch would be Victor Emmanuel II, his king. Cavour successfully, over a series of diplomatic moves and through military actions, successfully defeated the Austrians and kicked them out of northern Italy. Another individual who shaped Italian unification is shown here. His name is Giuseppe Garibaldi. He was a soldier from the south of Italy. His goal was to unify Italy as well, but he wanted to establish a republic, not a monarchy, but a republic. He invaded Sicily in the southern part of Italy, and he had a famous army. He started with 1,000 red shirts, and against all odds, they were able to unify the southern portions of Italy. So if you follow the arrows here, he and his troops started in the island of Sicily, and then they went to the Italian mainland and followed up north and began to unify the people there. Eventually, the forces led by Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel II united and unified all of Italy by 1870 under a parliamentary monarchy, and Victor Emmanuel II was the king. German unification came about a little differently. Once again, here's that map of Europe from 1815. The arrow here points to one of the boundaries of the German Confederation. Under Napoleon, he didn't create the nation of Germany, but he created a loose confederation of these Germanic states. Here's a close-up of these German states. There's Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, and the strongest of these German states was Prussia. The arrows point to the two regions that were controlled by Prussia. Two individuals shaped German unification. Here we see the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm I. He was the king of Prussia. His goal was to unify all of those German states into one country. The Kaiser's lieutenant is shown here. His name was Otto von Bismarck. He was the prime minister of Prussia. He was the one who put the goal into action and led the Prussian policy to unify Germany. He always had one standard that he never wanted to violate, and that was to never, under any circumstances, fight against Russia. Bismarck knew that any unification of German states would be a threat to France because of their shared border. So he always wanted to maintain positive relations with Russians because he didn't want to have a tenuous relationship with the country to his west and east. Well, I want to describe the event that led to Germany's unification, and this was the Franco-Prussian War. It began in 1870. This was a war between France and several German states, led by the Prussians. Well, the French lost, and it was incredibly bloody for both sides. The results of this war would shape European history for the next 100 years. First of all, as a result, Germany became unified as a nation. The arrow here points to Otto von Bismarck, who proclaimed the creation of Germany following the defeat of the French, and he did so at the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. There were other results as well. Because the French had lost the war, they had to pay for the cost of it, and reparations totaled about $5 billion. The French also had to give up territory, the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. The circled area of this map identifies Alsace and Lorraine. This was on the French-German border, and it included people that were of French and German heritage. The Franco-Prussian War was important because of these results, and it also ensured something. As a result of the French loss and of these harsh provisions, it ensured that the French would hate the Germans for decades, and it poisoned relations between these two countries for the next 60, 70, 80 years. The last of these new ideologies would be Imperialism. So I think we just need to begin with some simple definitions. Imperialism is extending the power of one country over another region. Basically, you're establishing a colony. In the late 1800s, different European nations competed to establish colonies all over the world. There were a range of reasons as to why different European nations established colonies. One was their strategic locations. We see this with the actions of the British as well as the French. This map identifies imperialism in Africa on the eve of the First World War. The first arrow points to the British control in Egypt. They established the Suez Canal, which had a major strategic impact on shipping. The second arrow points to South Africa. Again, the British established a colony there, and it was an important port. The white arrow shows Algeria, and the French controlled this blue region on the map because of its strategic location, again, to the entrance to the to the Mediterranean. Colonies were established for their economic value as well. We see this with the British in Egypt, South Africa, India, as well as China. Egypt provided a great deal of cotton as well as wheat for the British. South Africa was famous for its diamonds. The arrows here point to China and India. Silk, spices, rice, and many other valuable commodities came from Asia as part of the British Empire. A final factor dealt with pride. This was seen with the German activities in Africa. The arrows here point to German colonies in Africa, in Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa. These weren't strategic locations. They actually cost more than the value that they took from these regions. However, Germany wanted to show that it was a great nation as well, just like the British and the French were, so they established colonies as well. As a result of imperialism, a tremendous legacy was left behind. First of all, European culture, ideas, their economies, their thought processes, their religions were spread throughout the entire globe. However, this led to a tremendous amount of resentment. These colonies were established by force. Raw materials were simply taken from these regions. Local economies suffered, so the legacy was largely negative for these colonial people. Well, let's see if we can tie some of these main arguments together in some sort of a conclusion. The focus of this presentation was on the development of 4 key ideologies: socialism, political liberalism, nationalism, and imperialism. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that's able to define and apply these ideologies to the different events that took place in Europe between 1815 and 1900, and then to evaluate which ideology do you believe had the greatest impact on European history. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new, and hopefully you found it interesting. Take care, have a good day, and we'll see you soon.